The first time I saw it, the creature was half buried, its face peeking out of the damp soil in the corner of my basement. I laughed nervously, thinking it was a forgotten doll. But then it blinked, and the smile on its cracked, leathery face grew wider. The basement had always unnerved me. The air there seemed heavier, colder, almost alive in a way that made me want to leave as soon as I entered. That day, I was on autopilot, clearing out my parents' things. It wasn't until I reached the far corner, where the concrete gave way to packed earth, that I stopped. There was a bump in the dirt, small, subtle, but enough to draw my attention. My hand brushed over it, and the ground felt softer, looser, as if freshly dug. I swept away the dirt, expecting to find a rock or an old tool. Instead, a face stared back at me. At first, I thought it was a doll, a pale, cracked face with faintly sunken eyes. But then, it blinked. My heart seized. I scrambled back, my flashlight tumbling to the floor. The thing's lips twitched, curving into a smile so wide it seemed to split its face. It wasn't human, couldn't be, but its eyes, dark and bottomless, locked onto mine like it knew me. I couldn't move. My mind screamed to run, but my body was frozen, my breath shallow and ragged. When it whispered something low and indistinct, I finally found the strength to bolt. Didn't stop until I was upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, clutching my chest as if I could physically hold my heart in place. My hands shook uncontrollably, my thoughts racing with denial. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But the basement door creaked softly, like a whisper reminding me it was still there. The first night after seeing it, I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw its face, the grin that stretched too far, the eyes that seemed to pull me in. By the second night, the noises started. Scratching faint at first, like mice scurrying in the walls. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself it was nothing unusual. But the scratching grew, louder, more deliberate, like nails raking against concrete. The basement door wouldn't stay closed. No matter how many times I latched it, I'd wake to find it slightly open. Just a crack, but enough to set my nerves on edge. And then the whispers began. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, almost inaudible murmur that seemed to come from below. But the longer I listened, the clearer it became. It was saying my name. The whispers followed me to bed, seeping through the walls and into my mind. I barely slept, jumping at every creak and shadow. By the third night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and a bat, determined to confront whatever was down there. The basement felt colder than before, the air thick with dampness. My footsteps echoed as I descended, the light from my flashlight cutting through the darkness. When I reached the corner where I'd seen the face, I froze. The dirt was undisturbed, flat, as if nothing had ever been there. Relief and confusion mixed in my chest, but then I saw them. Tiny, bare footprints, trailing through the dust. They stopped abruptly at the far wall, as if whoever or whatever had vanished into thin air. My throat tightened as a single thought whispered through my mind I wasn't alone. The footprints stopped abruptly at the far wall, vanishing into nothing. It was as if whatever had made them had stepped out of existence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I pressed my palms to the cold, rough surface of the wall. I didn't know what I was looking for, maybe a crack, a clue, some explanation for the impossible. My fingertips brushed something smooth and metallic, chilling my skin. A faint click echoed in the still air, and the section of the wall in front of me shifted. It groaned, sliding inward like an ancient door, revealing a narrow, dark passage. The sound scraped at my nerves, as though the house itself didn't want me to enter. A rush of cold, damp air spilled out, carrying with it a sickening metallic tang. The stench of decay lurked underneath, faint but sharp, enough to make me gag. I hesitated, shining my flashlight into the blackness ahead. The beam wavered as if the air was thicker there, alive with something unseen. I took a cautious step forward, then another, until the light revealed walls slick with moisture. The passage was so narrow my shoulders brushed the sides, the damp soaking into my shirt as I crept further in. My breath fogged the air, each exhale, trembling as the chill seeped into my skin like 100 icy needles. The room at the end was like nothing I'd ever seen. It felt impossibly old, like it had been there, long before the house was built. The floor was dirt, packed but uneven, and the shelves lining. The walls were filled with objects that radiated unease. A rusted shovel leaned in one corner, its blade crusted with something dark and dried. It struck a chord of recognition. I'd seen it before, propped against the basement wall when I was a kid. Back then, I'd thought nothing of it. On one of the shelves, a brittle piece of yellowed paper caught my eye. The drawing on it sent a chill down my spine. A face, jagged and grinning, half buried in the ground. Its crude lines conveyed something alive, something watching. And then there was the journal. My father's name was scrawled across the cracked leather cover, the letters shaky and uneven. My hands trembled as I opened it. The pages were brittle. The ink smudged, but the words screamed desperation. He wrote of the face in the earth, describing how he'd uncovered it while digging a root cellar. He spoke of whispers, of promises, or of hunger. The final entry made me freeze. If you see it, never smile back. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. When the beam returned, I saw something in the corner, a subtle shift in the dirt, as if something beneath it was stirring. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that room staring at the drawing, the journal, the shifting dirt. My father's warning echoed in my head. If you see it, never smile back. But when I finally drifted off, the nightmares came. In the dream, I was standing in the basement, bathed in that cold, suffocating darkness. The face was there, but it wasn't buried anymore. It stared up at me, its eyes glinting like dull, wet stones. Its grin stretched wider and wider, splitting its face until rows of glistening, jagged teeth emerged. I wanted to scream, to move, to do anything, but I was frozen, helpless as its laughter began low and guttural, rising to a pitch that sounded like metal scraping on stone. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air, my sheets tangled around me. My skin was clammy, and the room felt colder than it should. My eyes darted to my hands, and my heart dropped. Dirt dark. Wet soil clung to my palms, streaking across the bed. I stared at it, my mind racing. Had I gone back to the basement in my sleep? Was this some kind of sick prank? But deep down I knew the truth. The whispers grew louder that night. They no longer stayed in the basement. They seeped through the walls, curling around me like smoke. I pressed my hands over my ears, but the sound found its way inside my head, soft and insistent. The house shifted, groaning as if alive. The floorboards creaked in rhythmic patterns like footsteps pacing just out of sight. Shadows flickered in the corners of the room where no light could reach. By the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. My exhaustion turned to desperation. Grabbing my flashlight, I stormed down to the basement, determined to end whatever was happening. The air grew colder with each step I descended. The light from my flashlight trembled as if it, too, was afraid. When I reached the corner, my stomach clenched. It was no longer buried. The creature had emerged halfway from the dirt, its body twisted and wrong, like it had been, pulled together by something that didn't understand how humans worked. Its grin stretched, impossibly wide, its teeth gleaming like broken glass. Its eyes, black and hollow, locked onto mine, and I felt every muscle in my body tighten. Stay and play, it whispered. Its voice warped and hollow, like a child's voice slowed to a crawl. I stumbled back, my flashlight shaking. I turned to run, but my feet hit solid ground. The stairs were gone, replaced by packed earth, trapping me with the thing that smiled too wide. The house wouldn't let me leave. The house had become a prison. No door would open, no window would break. the whispers followed me everywhere now, louder, more insistent. The shadows on the walls writhed when I wasn't looking directly at them, twisting into shapes that made my stomach churn. I had no choice. I had to stop it, whatever it took. I turned to the journal again, flipping through its fragile pages. My father's words felt desperate, fragmented, but one passage stood out to bind it. Return what was taken. It didn't explain much, just fragments of rituals, symbols hastily sketched in the margins, and a list of items: soil, fire, blood, and something sharp. I scavenged the house, gathering what I could. The kitchen yielded a rusty knife. From the garden, I scooped handfuls of damp soil. For fire, I grabbed a candle. The last item, blood, would have to come from me. My hands shook as I pricked my finger, letting a drop stain the page as if sealing my resolve. The basement was colder than ever, the air oppressive, each step down feeling like a weight pressing on my chest. It was waiting for me. Fully emerged now, the creature towered over the dirt where it had once been buried. Its body was grotesque, limbs too long, its skin stretched tight over a shape that didn't belong. The grin, it was the worst part, stretched from ear to ear, showing rows of jagged teeth that glistened in the dim light. It didn't move, but its hollow eyes followed me as I knelt in the dirt. My voice cracked as I began to chant the words scrawled in the journal. The creature twitched, its head tilting sharply, the smile twisting into something angry. Its body writhed, its limbs convulsing as if fighting against the pull of my words. The ground beneath it began to shift, loose dirt swirling like water as it sank. Its screams pierced the air, a sound so inhuman it rattled my teeth. Slowly, inch by inch, it disappeared into the earth. When it was gone, the basement fell silent. I sat there, shaking, staring at the empty dirt. I thought I'd won. But then I felt an unfamiliar tightness in my cheeks. My hands trembled as I reached for my face. I couldn't stop smiling. My reflection in the basement's cracked mirror confirmed it. The grin was there, stretching too far, my teeth too sharp. It wasn't just the creature that was bound. It was me. Calm. I stood at the edge of the basement, staring at the door I had bolted shut hours ago. My hands clenched the cold metal of the latch, but I couldn't bring myself to open it, no matter how many times I tried. I always found myself back here, standing at this threshold, my own reflection in the dusty glass window, smiling back at me in that same wide, unnatural grin. I couldn't leave. I'd tried every door, every window. The house twisted and turned, folding in on itself, always leading me back to the basement door. The whispers were louder now. They weren't just calling my name, they were repeating my thoughts, my voice, my secrets. I knew I wasn't alone. Yesterday, someone knocked at the door. A man in a suit, holding a clipboard, said he was interested in buying the property. I don't even remember inviting him in, but suddenly he was, standing in the foyer, smiling politely as he commented on the house's character. I led him to the basement before I could stop myself, my legs moving of their own accord. The whispers swelled, vibrating through the walls, urging me onward. He followed without hesitation, chatting about renovations, unaware of the damp chill that made the air heavy. At the top of the basement stairs, I paused. "It's just down there," I said, my voice calm. Steady, someone else's voice entirely. He descended slowly, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. I waited until he was out of sight, then listened. First, there was silence. Then, the sound of dirt shifting, like something clawing its way up from the earth. The scream came next, sharp and desperate, but it ended too quickly. I turned back to the foyer. The mirror above the mantel reflected me, but it wasn't my face. Staring back, it was its face, and it was still smiling. The whispers are quieter now, but they're never gone. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint scratching at the walls, as if the house is alive, waiting for the next visitor. Do you hear it too? Maybe it's just the wind, Or maybe you shouldn't look over your shoulder because you're not alone. If you dare, share this story. But remember, every time it's retold, the whispers grow louder. Who knows, you might hear them tonight. Are you sure you're alone right now? Or is something smiling at you from the darkness? I froze in terror as the eyeless woman gilded closer, her hollow socket somehow locked onto me. Her presence felt suffocating, like she was peeling away my very soul. Then, in a voice soft, yet chilling, she uttered the impossible, "I see you." It started as a faint noise, so soft that I thought it might be my imagination. A whisper, deliberate and rhythmic, cutting through the quiet of my tiny apartment. I paused mid-step, every muscle in, my body tensing as the sound grew clearer, slicing through the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant creaks of the old pipes. It wasn't a neighbor's muffled conversation or the faint strains of a television. This sound was alive, and it was meant for me. The whisper seemed to come from the hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse thudding in my ears. My first instinct was to ignore it, to lock my door and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that I had to know. Was it someone in trouble? A prank? Or something else entirely? I tiptoed to the door, my bare feet silent against the cold wooden floor. My hand trembled as I turned the lock and cracked the door open, the cool air of the hallway hitting my face like a slap. The light in the hallway flickered faintly, bathing the space in an unsteady, sickly glow. It stretched out before me, familiar but oddly distorted, like I was seeing it through a warped lens. I leaned out cautiously. The hallway was empty, silent except for the whisper, which had grown sharper now, almost insistent. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the corner at the far end. My breath caught in my throat as I squinted into the shadows, my heart beat a wild drumbeat in my chest. And then I saw her. She stood perfectly still, her figure illuminated by the stuttering light. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in uneven, tangled strands around her shoulders. Her dress was torn and stained, clinging to her bony frame like it had been forgotten long ago. But it was her face, or the lack of it, that made my stomach churn. Where her eyes should have been, there was only smooth, blank flesh, as if someone had wiped her features clean. She tilted her head, and though she had no eyes, I could feel her gaze piercing me. My knees weakened as her voice reached me, soft yet echoing with an unnatural clarity, "I see you." Her words didn't just touch my ears, they crawled inside me, reverberating in my skull, etching themselves into my thoughts. I stumbled back, barely managing to keep my balance. And then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The hallway was empty again, the flickering light steady now, as though nothing had happened. The silence was worse than the whisper. My legs refused to move, and I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the empty space where she had been. I finally forced myself to shut the door and lock it, but it did little to shake the feeling that I was being watched. I slammed the door and leaned against it, gasping for breath as though I'd just run a marathon. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely lock the deadbolt. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart and my ragged breathing. I wanted to believe it wasn't real, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But her voice, that chilling whisper, still echoed in my ears. "I see you." I glanced around my apartment, desperate for something normal to ground me. My laptop, the stack of books on my desk, the half-empty coffee cup, all of it looked the same. But it felt different, like the air itself had grown heavier. The normal, familiar space that I called home now seemed alien, threatening. Something caught my eye, the clock on my desk. Its hands were frozen at 12:13. I frowned, walking over to it, trying to remember if I'd heard it stop. My phone, which had been charging beside the clock, was dead, its screen lifeless despite being plugged in. My chest tightened as I turned back toward the door, and that's when I saw it. There, on the inside of the door, was a faint black mark, smeared like a handprint. My breath hitched as I stepped closer to examine it. It wasn't dirt or paint. It looked almost like ash, fragile and uneven, as though it might crumble if I touched it. But I didn't dare. The rest of the night passed in a haze of sleeplessness. Every creak of the building made me flinch, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones no matter how many blankets I wrapped around myself. I left the lights on, too afraid of what might happen in the dark. I told myself it was nothing, just a trick of the mind, but deep down I knew better. The next night, the whisper came back. It started faint, just like before, but this time it was inside my apartment. My blood ran cold as I stood frozen in the middle of the room, straining to hear. The sound grew louder, more urgent, as though it was circling me, weaving through the walls. A sudden, icy draft swept through the room, making me shiver. Every window was closed, every vent shut tight. My skin prickled as the sensation of being watched overwhelmed me. I spun around, expecting to see her standing there, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling persisted. And I couldn't shake the idea that she was there, just out of sight. Then, as quickly as it had started, the whisper stopped. The silence left me trembling in the dark, my pulse racing. I knew one thing for certain: whatever had appeared in the hallway, it hadn't stayed there. It was inside now, and it wasn't leaving. I couldn't take the whispers anymore. Every night they returned, louder, closer, until I swore they were inside my skull. The black mark on my door had darkened, spreading in jagged lines like veins. I needed answers. I waited for Mrs. Hargrove, my elderly neighbor, to shuffle out of her apartment. She had lived here longer than anyone, and if anyone knew what was happening, it had to be her. When I stopped her by the mailboxes, she looked at me like she already knew what I was going to ask. "I've heard them too," she muttered before I could speak. The whispers, her hands trembled as she glanced toward the hallway. "You've seen her, haven't you?" My silence was all the confirmation she needed. Her face crumpled in fear. "Evelyn," she whispered. "She's cursed this place. She won't let it go." I pressed her for more, but she shook her head, her lips tightening into a thin line. "Get out," she said, her voice sharp and brittle. "While you still can." Her words haunted me as I searched online that night, digging through news archives until I found her. Evelyn Mills. She had died in this building, years ago, in the very hallway outside my door. The photo accompanying the article was blurred and old, but I recognized her immediately. The article described her descent into madness, her claims of being watched, followed. Then, the gruesome detail that chilled me to the bone: Evelyn had gouged out her own eyes. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally drifted off, the dream came. She was crawling toward me, her eyeless face grotesque and stretched in agony. "I see you," she whispered, her voice filling my ears, my head, my very soul. When I woke, I swore I could still hear her voice in the room. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the flickering lights cast long, shifting shadows that seemed alive. I clutched my bag tighter, determined to leave the building and never come back. But when I reached the end of the hallway, I froze. My door was there. Again. I spun around, my mind racing. I had just walked in the opposite direction, but somehow I was back where I'd started. Heart pounding, I tried again. I ran this time, faster than I thought possible, but the hallway seemed to stretch endlessly, warping and twisting as I moved. No matter how far I went, I always ended up in front of my door. That's when I heard her. The whisper, low and guttural, it seeped into my ears, freezing me in place. I turned slowly, and there she was, standing at the far end of the hall, her head tilted at that unnatural angle, her eyeless face staring straight at me. "You cannot hide," she said, her voice sharper now, cutting through the air like a blade. "I see your guilt." Memories I had buried long ago rushed to the surface: a childhood betrayal, A friend I had. Failed when they needed me most. Their face, their voice, their last look of desperation. Knees buckled as the weight of it crushed me. Evelyn moved closer, gliding silently down the hall, her whispers intensifying. The walls around me pulsated, black veins spreading like wildfire. The hallway wasn't just a passage. It was alive, feeding on my fear, my guilt. Evelyn wasn't a ghost. She was its vessel. And I was trapped in its grasp, forced to face the darkness I had tried so hard to forget. I stood in the hallway, the mirror clutched tightly in my trembling hands. The air around me was suffocating, thick with an unnatural chill that crept into my bones. Evelyn was there, a silhouette, at first, but her eyeless face emerged from the shadows as she moved closer. Her voice came. Before her, a haunting melody of whispers that grew louder, sharper, as if they were slicing through the air. "You cannot hide," she said, her head tilting at that same impossible angle. "You belong to this place now." Eerie, my legs refused to move. My mind screamed for me to run, to fight, to do anything, but her presence pinned me in place. With every step she took, the hallway darkened, the pulsating walls closing in. I raised the mirror, desperate to end this, to face her and confront whatever truth I had avoided for so long. The reflection didn't show Evelyn. It showed me. But not the me I knew, this version of myself. It was broken, hollow, with blackened eyes that stared lifelessly back at me. My breath caught as the mirror trembled in my grip, the edges of the glass cracking as her whispers filled my ears. "You are no different," Evelyn hissed, her voice inside my head now impossibly loud. "You let them fall." You turned away. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of her words crushed me. Memories I had buried, the guilt I had refused to acknowledge, surfaced in an overwhelming flood. My knees buckled, and the mirror shattered against the floor, the sound swallowed by the darkness. Evelyn leaned closer, her face inches from mine, though her eyeless sockets still saw everything. "You are one of us now," she whispered. "You always were." The hallway dissolved around me, and I woke, if waking is what you could call it, back in my apartment. Everything seemed normal at first. The black marks on the walls were gone, the whispers silenced. But something was wrong. The reflection in my mirror still wasn't mine. It watched me as I moved, its expression twisting into a knowing smile. A faint whisper echoed from the corner of the room. "I see you. I don't know if I've escaped. Maybe I never will. If you're reading this, if you've made it this far, I have only one piece of advice: don't listen to the whispers. Don't open the door. Because once you see her, she sees you. Are you sure you're alone as you finish this story? Or is something watching you from the shadows? If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling brings her closer to reality." The shed had always been a quiet, forgotten space until tonight. Now, something with many arms and no legs is clawing at the walls, the sound sharp and deliberate. Then, in a voice that shouldn't exist, it whispers my name, drawing me closer despite the terror freezing my every step. I've lived in this house for 6 years, surrounded by nothing but fields and woods. The kind of place where silence is almost a comfort, where the nights are quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. At least they used to be. The night it started, I was brushing my teeth, going through the usual routine, when I heard a faint, rhythmic scraping sound coming from the shed in the backyard. At first, I thought it was the wind rattling an old tool against the wall, or a raccoon scratching to get in. But this wasn't random. It was deliberate, sharp, like nails dragging against wood, stopping and starting in a pattern I couldn't quite place. The sound didn't stop. It grew louder, insistent, clawing at my nerves until I couldn't ignore it. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside into the cold night air, my breath fogging in front of me. The shed loomed at the edge of the yard, its doors swaying slightly in the breeze. With each step closer, the sound became more distinct, almost rhythmic scratch, Pause, scratch, pause. Like something inside knew I was coming. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the latch. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. Then, summoning what courage I had, I yanked the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. At first, there was nothing, just shadows thrown by the beam of my flashlight, tools scattered across the floor, cobwebs glistening in the corners. But then the light caught it. Hunched in the corner, something shifted. It had 3 long, jointed arms, its pale, slick skin glinting under the light. It dragged itself forward with an unnatural speed, its legless body twisting as it moved. I couldn't scream. I couldn't run. It tilted its head toward me, the smooth expanse of its face empty, except for a sliver of black where a mouth should have been. Then it whispered, my name scratching through the air like broken glass. I don't remember running back to the house, only the sheer, animal terror driving me forward. I slammed the door behind me, my hands shaking so badly I could barely lock it. My chest heaved as I pressed my back against the door, straining to listen. The night was silent now. Too silent. I told myself it wasn't real. It couldn't be. Some kind of animal, maybe a trick of the light. But the sound of that voice, my name, rasping and brittle like something forced through a broken throat, was etched into my mind. By morning, I convinced myself it had to be a bad dream. In the daylight, the shed looked harmless, just an old wooden structure surrounded by frost. I forced myself to go back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. When I opened the door, the creature was gone, but the floor wasn't empty. Scratches covered the wood, deep and jagged, crisscrossing like something had frantically clawed at it. My tools were scattered in strange, deliberate patterns, but nothing was missing. It felt like the space had been disturbed, violated. That night, the noises returned. Not scraping this time, but tapping soft, deliberate, against the windows. I sat frozen on the couch, my breath catching in my throat with each hollow sound. Tap. Pause. Tap. It was faint, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. My name, repeated over and over, the voice lilting like it was trying to mimic someone human. I forced myself to check the windows, peering into the darkness, but there was nothing there. Still, the air felt wrong, heavy, oppressive, like something was pressing against the house, waiting to be let in. I left the lights on and sat awake, heart pounding, knowing sleep would not come. The next morning, sunlight should have brought comfort, but it didn't. My nerves were frayed. Every sound around the house twisting my stomach into knots. The thought of the shed, what I'd seen in it, loomed over me like a shadow. If I wanted any peace, I had to do something about it. Clearing it out seemed like a good start. Maybe if the shed was empty, it would feel less alive. The air inside was colder than I expected, stale and heavy with the scent of mildew and rust. Worked slowly, pulling out dusty tools and piles of old junk. But as I moved a warped wooden table, I spotted something tucked into the corner, a rotting wooden chest covered in cobwebs. My breath hitched as I brushed it off, revealing rusted hinges and a faint claw-like mark scored into the lid. I opened it. Inside were things that shouldn't have been there. A notebook filled with symbols and markings I couldn't read, scrawled with an almost desperate hand. A child's toy shaped like a crude figure. With 3 arms, its painted face smudged into a hollow expression. And a photograph. The picture showed a man standing in front of the shed. His expression was tight, unreadable. But the shed was unmistakable. It looked newer in the photo, the wood fresh and clean. Scrawled on the back in shaky handwriting were the words, "Do not open." I tried to push the unease away, but something about the man's face felt wrong, too familiar. Spent the rest of the day digging into the property's history, visiting the local library and scouring public records. I learned the house had belonged to a man named Gerald, a recluse who Neighbors described his strange stories about him were vague but chilling lights in the woods, sounds coming from the shed late at night. Then, one day, Gerald vanished. My stomach dropped when I stumbled upon an old genealogy chart. Gerald wasn't just the house's previous owner, he was my distant uncle. The house had been passed down through the family, though no one had stayed long. It wasn't just coincidence that I'd ended up here. The shed wasn't just some forgotten structure. It was tied to my family. And the creature wasn't random. It was waiting for me. That night, the noises became unbearable. The scratching, once faint, was now loud enough to rattle the windows. But it wasn't just scratching anymore, it was a low, guttural growl, a sound that didn't belong to any living thing I knew. My fear was replaced by anger, a desperate kind of courage. I grabbed a flashlight and a crowbar, my fingers shaking as I gripped them tightly. Whatever was in the shed, I was going to face it. I flung the shed door open, but the space was empty. The scratches on the walls were fresh, deep grooves carved into the wood, but the creature was gone. My breath came in shallow, gasps as the silence pressed down on me. Then I felt it. A chill swept through me, not from the wind but from something deeper, like a presence that clung to my skin. I turned back toward the house, and as I reached the porch, the lights inside flickered. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as if the house itself was alive. The whispers began again, louder and angrier. They didn't just call my name this time. They spoke my fears, my regrets, things I'd never spoken aloud. Words I didn't even realize I'd been thinking. Panicking, I tried to leave, but every door I opened led me back to the shed. No matter how many steps I took, I ended up in front of that cursed place. The hallway inside the house stretched endlessly, the walls warping and twisting like something alive. Then it spoke. Not a whisper this time, but a voice so deep and guttural it made my knees buckle. You belong to me. You always have. I collapsed, clutching my head as the shadows around me writhed. The creature wasn't just in the shed anymore, it was everywhere. I didn't have a choice. Running wasn't an option, and hiding had already failed. If I was going to survive, I had to face it. The flashlight in my hand felt useless, its beam trembling against the suffocating dark. The shed door creaked open on its own, revealing the creature in its full, grotesque form. Its 3 impossibly long arms scraped against the walls, their joints bending in unnatural directions. Its flesh glistened, pale and wet, and its eyeless face turned toward me. It moved faster than I expected, dragging its legless body across the floor with terrifying speed. The whispers became screams, echoing in my ears, accusing me of every failure, every regret. You let them fall. You turned away. You deserve this. My hands tightened around the crowbar, and I swung with everything I had. But it passed, through the creature like smoke. It was untouchable, unstoppable. The shed's walls dissolved into darkness, revealing a void that stretched endlessly. The creature's arms wrapped around me, cold and unyielding. Its whispers pierced my mind, drowning out my thoughts. You cannot escape. You are mine. And then, it pulled me into the void. The story ends with a chilling, unresolved fate. The protagonist is consumed by the creature, leaving only an empty shed behind. Did the protagonist escape, or is the creature now waiting for someone new to stumble upon its domain? The whispers suggest the creature's hunger isn't sated, it's always searching, waiting for the next victim. Is it watching you now? When I woke up, it was morning, but everything felt wrong. The sunlight pouring through the window seemed pale, thin, as though it couldn't fully reach the room. I stumbled to the window, my head pounding, my body heavy with exhaustion. The shed was gone. In its place was a patch of bare earth, the grass around it brown and brittle, as though something had drained life from the ground. I wanted to believe it was over, that destroying the shed had ended whatever nightmare had taken root there. But as I turned to head back inside, I caught my reflection in the window. I froze. The face staring back at me wasn't entirely mine. The eyes were too dark, the smile stretched too wide, holding a knowing expression that sent ice through my veins. I backed away from the glass, refusing to look, refusing to believe. The house was quiet, eerily. So, but I could feel it, the weight of something unseen pressing against my chest. It was still. Here. That night, the whispers started again, faint and distant at first, just a soft scraping sound at the edge of hearing. Then came the tapping on the windows. I didn't look. I couldn't. I thought the nightmare was over, but now I know it never will be. The creature is gone, but its presence lingers, waiting, watching. And sometimes in the dead of night, I wonder if it's still out there, or if it's inside me now, waiting for its next victim. I thought it was over. For weeks, the whispers stopped, the tapping on the windows ceased, and the house grew quiet. But the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, stretching out like the heavy calm before a storm. I knew deep down that whatever I had faced in the shed wasn't gone, it was waiting. Tonight, the quiet shattered. I was lying in bed when I heard it, the faint, rhythmic scratching. It started at the edge of the house, soft and distant, but it grew louder with every passing second, moving closer. Scrape. Pause. Scrape. My heart pounded as I sat up, my hands clutching the blanket like a lifeline. Then, from the darkness, it whispered my name. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But my body moved on its own, my feet hitting the cold floor as I stumbled toward the window. The tapping started again, sharp and deliberate, and my breath hitched as I pulled back the curtain. There was nothing there. Just my reflection in the glass, except it wasn't mine. Its dark eyes stared back, unblinking, its twisted smile spreading as it mouthed the words I couldn't hear but already knew. I see you. The lights flickered, and the air grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. I turned, and it was her. The creature stood in the doorway, its 3 long arms stretching out, its eyeless face tilting toward me. It didn't move, but its whispers filled the room, louder and louder, until they drowned out every thought. You cannot run. You cannot hide. You are mine. I don't know what will happen next. Maybe it will take me, or maybe it's already inside me, waiting to be set free. But if you're reading this, if you've made it this far, beware. The creature is patient. It knows your fears, your regrets, and all it needs is a way in. The whispers never stop, they just grow quieter, waiting for the right moment. If you hear them, don't look. Don't listen. And for your own sake, don't open the door. Are you sure you're safe as you finish this story? Or is something watching you, waiting for the shadows to fall? If you dare, share this story, but remember, every retelling strengthens its grip. Will you risk it following you home?